Loved animal print, loved a wine, had
Both
similar
had
kind
dead
of
mums.
both had dead mums,
Yeah.
so much in common.
Like, I really like the guilt it's an awful emotion to feel, when people blame themselves for their loved ones dying.
Sometimes I feel guilt. We're like the guilt train over here for 3 different reasons. I feel guilt because I feel like my grief was like later.
I don't think time heals grief, and I don't think it should. But when it comes to trauma, you can heal trauma.
All right, well, Sally and Im, I really appreciate you all being here again from quite a distance away.
Australia, or the other side of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, what is it, like 8,000 miles or something? Pretty far.
I haven't counted, but we'll just assume that's a fact right there. So.
Oh, it's good to be here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, of course. And as I alluded to already, your Good Mourning podcast resonates heavily with me just because of your mix of grief and just raw honesty and humor mixed all in like one crazy ass ball. So I love the way y'all approach the conversation. And, there's a lot of questions I'm probably going to want to tap into, but I definitely want to start with the inspiration as to why you two have this platform. And I'm assuming that comes from loss.
It does. It comes from loss. Sal and I both lost our mums suddenly, months apart. My mum, Vanessa, died by suicide in February of 2020, and Sal's mum, Rose, died from a sudden seizure in her sleep in November 2019. And we didn't know each other. And it was actually the feelings of isolation and loneliness in grief that led us to each other and was the inspiration, I think, behind starting Good Mourning, our platform.
How did you two meet? How did you guys get connected on this?
So we joined an online support group for women who have lost their mums. So it's like a Facebook group. And I think somebody was organising a meetup, weren't they, Im? So they created like a little private event within the group and we both clicked on it. It was in Sydney. And we just met at this pub. It was like a grief meetup. And I think we were both we both had support and we have friends and we had support. But you might have found this as well, David. Even when you've got support, if people around you haven't experienced loss or grief, it can be really hard to talk about it openly, like how you really are, And so Im and I felt like quite lonely. And because we were in our early 30s, and I mean, for you, it would have been the same, if not even more so, right? Because you were really young when you experienced your loss, and a lot of your friends often haven't been through a similar thing. So you're trying to kind of talk about how you are, and they want to support you, and the support is there, but also like they can't really meet you at your level because they don't really get it. So Im and I were like, well, we really want to meet somebody who gets it because this is bloody lonely and we're feeling really lonely. And so yeah, we ended up rocking up at this pub on like a Sunday afternoon, and we both were like, what are we doing? This is like really not our vibe. We both nearly pulled out, didn't we? And then we were just
nearly backed out at the 11th hour. I think I've even got out to the front. I was like, I'm not going in. I'm not a support group type of person, even though, everyone is when you need it. But yeah, we nearly didn't go. So we felt as well as a lot of fate that brought us to each other, and we feel like our mums were also having a hand in it all. But yeah, so glad that we did walk through the doors of that pub that day, because I think we'd still be really struggling.
Totally. So yeah, so basically we met and hit it off pretty instantly and bonded over our grief, and we were similar ages, similar kinds of loss, liked the same thing, loved animal print, loved a wine, had
both
similar
had dead mums.
Both had dead mums, so much in common. And we just got talking. We would talk for hours about grief, and we must have sounded like great chat when people were listening, overheard our conversations. But it was like we would talk about things, and it was like having a mirror held up, things like, oh my God, are you feeling really anxious? Or do you just feel constantly exhausted? And we'd both be like, oh my God, yes, what's going on? And it just really alleviated that sense of loneliness. And then we kind of got talking about well, if we're feeling like this, there must be so many other people who are feeling like this, but also feel like there's not a lot of grief support out there. Because for us both, when we Googled like grief support, particularly in Australia, it's different for other parts of the world, but here in Oz, like it was just all really like fuddy-duddy. Is that a word in the US? Like fuddy-duddy?
Feathers and, just old school.
Like kind of like just very like outdated. And we were like, God, where's the grief support that speaks to us? Like real conversations, a few swear words,
Colourful.
using humour. And so that's when we decided to start Good Morning to like what you're doing, David, like talk about grief in just a very honest way and have real conversations about it. So that's probably quite a long-winded way of telling you how we met and how we came to do what we're doing.
Yeah, no, that's the most productive meeting at a pub I've ever heard in my life. So that's cheers to that. That's incredible. I think more grief support groups should meet at a pub. It's interesting it makes sense as to finding that, that common line. And I think any trauma, whether it's grief or whatever the hell you're going through, it's nice to have that commonality, that it offers some comfort and understanding. But at the same time, I think we grieve so differently. So I'm interested in hearing, though you found some sort of peace and bonding with the feelings that you were having, loneliness, but what were the difference in feelings? Because you both lost your moms in such different ways. You know what I mean? Like grief hits in different ways on how it's happened and where you are in your life. So was there any conversation or differences between your two grief processes that you've noticed?
Absolutely. I love this topic. Sal and I, like we said, we're very similar. And we just had so many things in common, but the way that we grieved was so different, like polar opposite ends of the spectrum. So as I mentioned, my mum died by suicide. It was very, very traumatic. My grief was very visceral and physical. Like I just felt like I couldn't do anything. I was just a heap on the floor, howling for my mum. Like it was all encompassing emotions, like all the emotions, I'm feeling them and they're very much on display. When it came to things like practical tasks, I couldn't do any of them. This is where Sal will step in and she'll share her experience in a minute. But yeah, I couldn't even help with the planning of the funeral, couldn't even like comprehend the fact that she was dead, let alone think about turning up at the funeral. Like I didn't even want to go. I was like, this is so fucked up. I'm not like, I just can't. And yeah, this is the thing about grief as well, is like a lot of people assume it's just sadness, but as you probably very well know, David, like it's so much more than sadness. And for me, I think the two main emotions that I did feel for pretty much the whole year were anger and guilt. And they kind of, saw me through that full first year where people expect you to kind of get over your grief after that. But I was just still coming to terms with it and then feeling all these emotions that society don't even tell you you're going to feel. So, yeah, I'll let Sal fill you in on her experience. But that was mine very much the first year. Lots of anger, lots of guilt and just all-encompassing emotions.
And mine was quite different, really. Like, I don't think I felt a lot of anger, really. Like maybe like in bursts, but it wasn't really a prevalent emotion for me. I think I felt a lot of guilt, like him, because my mum lived in the UK, so I wasn't like close to her like physically when she died. And I didn't see her that often. So being an expat, you start kind of feeling all of that guilt for like choosing to live on the other side of the world and, all of the what ifs and ruminations. For me, though, my grief was really practical. So I had to fly back to the UK the next day and I had to sort my mum's estate out and take charge of everything, plan the funeral, all of that stuff. And I coped really well. And I almost like needed to do stuff. And I needed that to be practical, to be able to process. But at the time, I was really judging myself. Like, well, how am I able to plan the funeral, to call people up and tell them that she's dead, without breaking down all the time? And how was I able to clear her house out and go through her things and think? And a part of it was like I didn't really have a choice because it was on me. But the other part of it was like, actually, that was my coping style. And they call it there's two spectrums, like mentioned. So there's the intuitive griever who feels like very, their grief is visceral. And then there's the instrumental griever, which I think I lean more towards. I'm more practical. I can talk more rationally about my person. And I think like my grief was there, and the emotion and the sadness, and all of the kind of the deep pain was there, but I could also function day to day and still kind of organize stuff. And I actually really judged myself really hard for that, because I thought I should be on the floor, right? Like, how am I able to go to the funeral home and take care of all this stuff and go out and see my friends and have like dinner and also be fine? And I think that's another thing. Like, even the days after my mum died, when I was in deep shock and deep pain, I also was with friends and family, and I was able to have very small moments where I smiled, and I felt like little moments of like feeling loved and that comfort. And I judged myself again for letting those in. But I think it's a really important one also to know that it's like you kind of need those moments, right, to be able to cope. I'd love to know what you are, David. Are you like more? Are you more practical? Are you more?
Are you on the floor howling like me, or are you getting shit done like Sal?
I was trying to compose myself because I've never thought of it like that. I guess with a title, when you're saying intuitive and instrumental, if I heard that correctly. And I want to say, I don't want to sound like a cop-out, but I want to say a little bit of both, but I think I would definitely lean towards instrumental. But it's different for me because, not for me, like it's just, I sometimes I feel guilt. So we're like the guilt train over here for 3 different reasons. I feel guilt because I feel like my grief was like later, because I forgot. I've mentioned this so many times to people that have listened to the podcast, but I forget so much because I was 12 years old when it happened, and there's some. I'm not a grief expert per se, but like I've the trauma of losing my father at a young age, like a defense mechanism, and who the hell knows, with just 9/11 and the capacity that was affected my brain. But there's so much that I don't remember that I feel like there's a lot of shit that I dealt with down the road. But nevertheless, there's always shit that you deal with down the road, whether you forgot it or not. I think, grief evolves in the way we evolve, so that just naturally changes. But I want to say who I am today, especially having this podcast. And I don't know if that's just because it's been over 20 years, but I would like to think that I'm more instrumental and able to, I still feel it, but sometimes maybe I do feel guilty that I don't feel things more. And maybe I relate to you a little bit there more, Sally. Like, it's not that I don't know. It is a weird guilt to feel like you're not feeling enough. You know what I mean? That is a commonality that I've heard from a lot of people. And then you see where I'm curious to see what your guilt was like, because when it comes to suicide, I'm sure that comes in many different facets. Did that guilt come from any specific questions you were asking yourself?
All of the questions. I think with suicide, there's so many unanswered questions, and I think from the work that we've done, I feel like I've come to a pretty good place of understanding as to where that role of guilt comes into play. So it's really difficult to imagine anything like that, anything like happened to you, David, anything like happened to Sal, like losing our loved ones so suddenly, not getting to say goodbye, not, just getting thrown into this world of grief without any preparation or warning. It's very chaotic. And it's hard to imagine that like these fucked up things can just happen out of nowhere, out of the blue, right? We just go to work that day, or we're going to school on that day, or, I just get up and make my breakfast as if it's a normal day, but you don't realize what's about to happen. And I think that can make us feel really out of control of our lives. And that's really frightening, right? So I think guilt it's our mind's way of taking back a bit of that control. It's been like, well, if I'd have said this, it wouldn't have happened. If I'd have done this differently, it wouldn't have happened. If I'd have, called my dad and told him to come pick me up from school, he wouldn't have been there. We go through all of these different scenarios that if our actions were different and played out differently, then our person would still be here and we have some control back over our life. So I think that, in a sense, is a way why we do blame ourselves and why we do experience that emotion. But it's taken a long time for me to get to that point. Like, I really like the guilt it's an awful emotion to feel, when people blame themselves for their loved ones dying. It's really difficult, but I think it's very common. And I think no matter how your loved one died, like people often experience guilt. And yeah, for me, it was very much like, why didn't I call my mum 2 minutes earlier? Or why, just all the whys and the what ifs and the if onlys. There were a lot of them. So I won't list them all. But yeah, that's kind of how I've come to terms with that emotion and deal with it.
Do you think the guilt is almost necessary? Like, obviously we want to work our way
Yes.
out of there, but is it like, are some of these shitty feelings necessary to get out of there? Because I mean, it might be a weird question. I never even asked that. I just said that. I don't even know where that was coming from, but it seems like being aware of the guilt that you've both felt may have, forced you to ask hard questions that may not have been true. Because some of those questions are just dead end questions, like what would they have done? No, that's not really how life works, in my opinion. But they are natural questions. So, like, do you think that those questions still are necessary to get through the grief?
Yes.
I think so. And I remember when we interviewed David Kessler, who's a grief expert based in the States, and he said, like, guilt is the companion of grief. Like, it's really hard to escape guilt when you're grieving. But I do think that it does, it does make you confront some things and dig deep, and it can be really, really difficult, but also it can shine a light on some things that you need to work through too.
I think as well, all the emotions and all the kind of physical, the whole experience of grief is necessary. I think as a society, we just try to push it down and not feel it and not allow it and try and rush through it and, get over it and all those things that people try to do that's just impossible. I think all of those experiences have a necessary place. Like, we've got to go through the process. We've got to feel these feelings that come up and these thoughts that come up. Like, we've got to go through it. But I think the important part is we don't get stuck. And I think a lot of people can get stuck, and that's when it gets really difficult.
So this is a question for both of you. What have you both found as being the best practice or the biggest learning lesson that you've accomplished? Let me rephrase that. I want to say accomplished. This is like not a race. But what is the biggest thing y'all have learned or have taken from your process that has gotten you through it?
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm not saying you have to pigeonhole it to one thing, of course, but, is there anything that stands out?
In terms of processing grief, a couple of things, like just back to talking about like being practical and being like maybe more of an instrumental griever. We talked to this lady called Megan Reardon Jarvis on our podcast recently, and she's a psychotherapist, and she was talking about how to grieve is grief is a verb, right? To grieve, you can grieve in loads of different ways, and some of those ways are being practical and doing the things that we were just talking about. And that just really gave me comfort to know that while I thought I wasn't grieving in the right way, actually, by being practical and doing that stuff, I was still grieving. Maybe even though I wasn't outwardly like all emotional all the time, it didn't mean that I wasn't processing my loss. So I just wanted to say that really helped me, because that might help some of your listeners as well. Because I think we can think of a society, if we're not like crying and we're not kind of outwardly expressing emotion all the time, that we're not processing. So I found that really helpful. And also for me, journaling has helped me, because it's just getting it out is the act of like dumping it out on the page is processing. And that I found really helpful for me personally in my grief. And also talking about it, like having conversations, has been really healing.
Love that.
Do you want to go, David, or I'll jump in with mine?
No, that was just a segue to you. I was saying I just want to acknowledge that. I love what she said. Yeah. I'm not saying shit. It's all you.
Just too keen for this question. Mine would, no, I love it. I love the questions that you're asking us. Mine would have to be learning about the mind-body connection and how grief impacts us physically, and how when you experience trauma, it actually lives in the cells in your body and stays stored in your body. And unless you do things to physically release that grief and that trauma out of your body, it's going to stay stuck. Again, I'm here with the word stuck. So learning about that connection and learning some of the different modalities that can help release trauma and stress and grief from the body has been one of the most healing things that I could have ever found out. So things like breath work. Sal and I are into Kundalini energy transmissions, which is just incredible. Like, we're all about the energy work and just understanding that everything is energy, and that energy, that traumatic energy is staying stored in your body. So we even realized, like, all of these other traumas that we were holding on to in our bodies, even prior to our mums dying, that we were just getting around. Yeah, cool. We don't even realize that, these things that we've been through are actually traumatic experiences that are staying stored in our cells. Sounds a bit wild. But, a lot of people have like gastrointestinal issues, anxiety disorders, all of these things that we're carrying around, and we don't get to the root of the problem. But that is why, that is the root. These things that you go through impact us physically, and then we just carry that around all the time. So I'm so excited about learning about this and, spreading awareness of how grief can impact us physically.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, as you kind of alluded to earlier, how, you found each other to get through what was the common bond of both losing your mom, yet you did it so differently. It's extremely fascinating how you handled it and how you literally reacted to it. So we're covering so much ground here. And I do want to, at some point, I would love to be the first one to say it. You guys have a book coming out, so I'm curious as to some point of how that comes into play. Besides your own grief process, how you plan, I'm sure, of helping other people, because I just find it so beautiful of when two people like you are, had to have your own traumatic experience and you're sharing it with the world as you do. I would love to see how that ties into the conversation and what you're accomplishing there. To give you guys a little plug there, because I'm genuinely curious. One question based on your experience, from your personal experience and all the people you spoke to and your community, have you found, is there any specific or a couple patterns that you've seen for people that are grieving? Of course, you talk about the grief stages and a couple of things you've already spoke, but are there any really fine line common denominators that you found between everyone that's grieving?
Definitely. I think I'd say there's probably 3 topics that we talk about on our podcast and on our social media channels that always seem to get a resounding response. And that is the experience of grief brain, which Im is very good at explaining. So I'll let Im tell you what grief brain is. Also loneliness and people dropping away and friends not showing up, or the people that you thought were going to show up not showing up. And that's always a really big topic from our community of grievers. And also anxiety, feeling really anxious after a loss is also another thing that we hear from a lot of our community, because it's almost like when you've experienced the worst possible thing, it's like you worry and create this anxiety almost as a safety blanket. It's like, well, if I worry and if I'm anxious, and it's a physical response to loss as well, but quite often we feel like the anxiety almost keeps us safe from the terrible things. So I would say, would you agree, Im? They're kind of the 3 most common things that we hear from our grieving community.
Definitely. Yeah.
I'll tell you. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, sorry,
I wasn't sure if that was an internet pause for me to speak, or is that just to be clear with everyone listening? So was it?
I don't know. I was just going to fill you in on what grief brain was.
Please.
You think we'd know our shit being podcasters? So we wanted to get to the bottom of why so many grievers feel really foggy and forgetful and confused after loss, which is one of the most common things that we hear in our community. So we interviewed a world-leading neurologist called Dr. Lisa Schulman. So she basically explained to us that when you are grieving, it's like an emotional injury to the brain, and it actually rewires your brain, changes the neuroplasticity, weakens the nerve growth, which then impact all the cognitive functions. So there's actually a reason as to why we feel all of these things. And finding that out, that information was so validating, because a lot of people think that there's something wrong with them. A lot of people go to the doctor to get blood tests because they just feel like there's something sinister going on, or it's really, really common to feel like you're not well or there's something seriously wrong. So hearing that, it's just really validating, and knowing that like grief is actually physically really exhausting, and this exhaustion can last for a long time, and this fogginess and forgetfulness can last for a long time. And it can also come back years later, in the lead up to the anniversaries or milestones. You can start to feel exhausted again or foggy and forgetful again, and you start judging yourself. Why am I feeling this way? But it's grief. And like you said before, David, like it evolves. But I don't think grief is something that we ever really get rid of. It's something that I think we learn to carry over time.
Oh, man, and how long has it been for both of you now? Like, Sally, how long has it been since you lost your mom?
3.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So yeah,
it's the same for you, 3.5 years.
3 and a bit, yeah.
And what have you two noticed in regards to those? 'Cause that's not that long. For some reason, I thought it was a little longer. I got over 20 years on you two.
We were straight in there, Dave. We were like,
We've nailed this grief shit. We're all over it now.
No.
We didn't rest on our laurels. We were like straight there.
I know. I'm like, shit. It took me 20 years to start this podcast. It's interesting because it's a great thing. It's impressive that 3.5 years y'all have made these realizations, but it seemed like it came with intention. You know what I mean? I think it's an interesting thought when I think about, does time heal all kind of thing, which I think time helps. I think time helps dim things, but without intention and without some work, are you just keeping that stagnant? Because I love what Im was saying about, the psychosomatic aspect, because I think that's the cause of so many things that are happening inside our body. We think sometimes, and it's a very sensitive topic for people that have experienced certain diseases, and I try to be gentle around it, not say it around certain people, but at the same time, whether it's stress or trauma, and there's such a cause and effect relationship there of the effects that we have later down the road about maybe stagnant energy and stagnant traumas and stuff that we haven't worked out. So it's just so important to me to have these discussions and see how you two have beautifully handled your own trauma, because you're both so intellectual on it. You both seem so intentional behind it, like I already said. So what have you two noticed between yourselves, and feel free to jump on, whoever wants to go first, about where you are 3.5 later and the jumps that you have made? Maybe like, where were you in year 1, 2 to today?
Well, it's something they call them the waves of grief, right? But we call them grief bombs because they feel like they just explode out of nowhere and they really catch you off guard. And I think for us both in the first, I'd say 18 months, they felt like they were pretty constant. And grief bombs lead to another thing that we've coined the term having a grief sesh, right? It's like having a grief session where you get the cards, the photos, and you grieve. And sometimes it happens because you've had a grief bomb, and sometimes you just feel griefy and you kind of know that you need to get it out. I had one yesterday, and but they don't happen as often now. And they were all the time, like for the first year and a half, I'd say, like constantly. For me, for some reason, my grief used to really manifest on a Sunday. Don't know what it was, but it was like Sunday I would feel really like particularly griefy. And it just became a running joke, didn't it? And be like, oh, it's a Sunday, I've got my grief sesh box out, I'm having a cry. And and it feels like now I think of my mum, but it doesn't always evoke an emotional response when I think of the memories, and like I can think of her and then move on from that like, you know what I mean? It's not like an all-consuming. And I remember Im and I in the early days, we'd talk about like, oh, have you had a day where you didn't think about your mum? And so I think it's just like they're always with us. We're always thinking and missing them. They're here, but it's not all-consuming, and it's not. It doesn't. The pain sort of just, it doesn't feel like it catches you off guard as much, for me anyway.
Damn, do you have a thought on your process?
We're doing that thing again.
Yeah. There's something going on.
I want to give you room to talk too, because I just feel like we're talking so much. But
no, I'm happy to listen. That's the whole point of this. I want to hear your thoughts. I'm curious as to what your evolution has been, as kind of Sally explained hers over the last 3.5 years. Sorry.
Yeah, I think mine's more so been around working through the trauma and understanding that you can't really heal from grief. It's not an illness that you eventually heal from. Like you asked before, does time heal all wounds? I don't think time heals grief, and I don't think it should. I think time does help soften it, but I think it's always there. But when it comes to trauma, you can heal trauma. And that was really important for me to learn and understand. And I think over the 3 years, my relationship with grief has changed. I think I looked at my grief and the death of my mum as this one big dark black thing. I was like, I want to get rid of it. This is so fucking horrible. I don't want to feel this anymore. But now I've kind of separated the two. I'm like, there's the trauma of the death of my mum, and then there's the grief. And I think both Sal and I now really view our grief as our connection to our mum. It's, our memories of our mums that we don't want to get rid of. And I'm conscious, David, that you said before that you've forgotten a lot of the memories, and that can be really difficult. But sometimes as well, it's like the stories that people share about them too. It's that connection. Your dad existed. He was very much a part of your life. So I think a lot of people don't ever want to let that go. And I think we've now turned our relationships with our mums into our grief, rather than looking at grief as this really horrible, awful thing that we want to get rid of, which society also wants to get rid of because they're uncomfortable around it. So, yeah, I think over the 3 years, I've worked through a lot of the trauma and with the different modalities that I spoke about before, but my relationship towards grief has definitely changed, and it's not something that I really want to ever go away now. And that may sound really wild to people who are listening to this and are really fresh in their grief, even though 3 years is still quite fresh. But yeah, it's not as all-consuming now, but a bit more bearable. And yeah, that's kind of been my experience over the years of it evolving.
And I think, just to add, having met Im, when we first met, Im was a completely different person, so in such a heavy place, understandably, because I think it was 6 months after your mum had died that we met, and to see the evolution of you and how you have come leaps and bounds and how you're coping with your grief. And I do think talking about it has really helped. I don't know if you find, Dave, talking about it is it's so helpful actually to process stuff. But I just want to acknowledge Im, because you're amazing, and you've just come so far. And
thanks, mate.
Yeah.
I was on a loop, Dave. Everything was just on a loop, ruminating for months and months and months. I couldn't get out of that loop. It was like, my mum's dead and this is the only thing that's going on in my mind. So yeah, I broke that loop and I got out. I'm re-engaged a bit with life, which I'd never thought would be possible. And I want to give that hope to anyone listening too. I was in such a dark hole. I was like, there's no hope for the future. I'm never going to be able to live a normalish life again after going through such trauma. But it is possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that's important. I love what you said, Em, about kind of separating, even though they're entangled in the same way, grief and trauma. You know what I mean? That grief does stay with you, but you can heal from the trauma. That makes so much sense to me. And it is important for what you're both saying about how you felt, especially in the moment, really going through it, even though you're, excuse me, still dealing with things, to show years later. I like showing the years later and asking that question as to the evolvement, because when you are in the middle of that quote unquote darkness, whatever the hell you're going through, whether it's losing someone or not, that's all you see. That's literally all you see is what's around you. And to think about, I can get out of this, just literally seems impossible. So I think it's really important to hear your entire process. You guys have been so articulate about how you've gotten to where you are today. And I just really want to commend you both on doing that, because you're doing so much good work, let alone for yourselves. And the talking about it, like you said, it is important. And also just to tap into what you said about the forgetfulness. There's memories that I forget, but it was more the frustrating part for me, as I've mentioned before, is more of the grief process for me as a kid that I feel like I blacked out on. Those are the things that are frustrating. Of course, there's memories that I don't remember, and who knows if there's things I would have forgot just in general, but it's more me reflecting back on who I was as a kid going through that process, because I feel like everything I had to handle was as I got older, when I became more of a man as opposed to what was my grief childhood like. But that's my own sob story that people don't need to hear again. But I have I have a couple questions that I want to, these like three bigger questions that I like to ask towards the end. I'm curious, especially during your own experience, but what do you girls think happens after we die? What are your beliefs with that?
Oh, this could be a whole other podcast chat, like a whole other episode, because I think like we are so interested in this topic and the afterlife, and it's something that we've got even more into since our mum's passed. And we do believe that that there is something that happens after you die. We don't think that death is the end, just from our experience of asking for signs and connecting with our mums, and it brings a huge sense of comfort that you can continue that relationship with them.
And that's something that's been also really comforting and healing for us in our grief as well, is speaking to psychic mediums. We've both had some phenomenal readings with psychics. We've had Laura Lynn Jackson on our podcast as well, who has written 2 incredible books on the afterlife and signs. And yeah, we are strong believers that this is not the end. Like, we've had psychic readings where it was almost like our mums were talking through the psychic, and they were using nicknames, and they just knew names and bits of information that there's no way that they could have known any other way other than legit they're talking to our dead mums in the afterlife. So
And it's something that brings a lot of comfort to our community, is asking for signs from loved ones who've passed. It's a big topic that Laura Lynn Jackson talks to. She's got a whole book on have you heard of her, David?
No, I'm actually
Laura
not
Lynn
familiar
Jackson.
with her.
Have you seen Surviving Death on Netflix?
Yes, I watched 49% of it. I didn't finish it.
Oh, well, do you remember there's like the blonde psychic lady they go and see, like long blonde hair?
This is the girl you're talking about?
Yeah, so
okay.
that's Laura
Very
Lynn
cool.
Jackson, but she's actually very into teaching people how to ask and receive for signs, and you can almost like co-create a language with your loved ones who've passed over. What about you? Like, are you into this? Is this like a topic? Like,
yeah, I'm very much into it. It's just I think this is a part of the frustration. I think sometimes there's a balance in life outside of grief, just in general. I think sometimes the willpower gets in the way of trying to make things happen, and sometimes I feel like I'm being too forceful with it, as opposed to just like maybe asking for something and just like letting it go at the same time. As I feel like I try to have those conversations with my dad, and I maybe I'm just overthinking it too much, and maybe I should check out her as well about methodologies of doing this, because I believe in this stuff. I've had near-death experiences. I've had some mediums on the podcast, and I think it's one of those things that does get a lot of controversy, and it splits the difference of believers and non-believers. But when you've had experiences like you two mentioned, where she's talking about things like how would you know, it's one of those things I think you just need to experience. But I haven't had any wild experiences like that. We spoke to mediums in the past, my family, a couple when I was really young, so I'd have to reflect back on that. But in regards to what you both just tapped into, I'm interested in that. I mean, energy cannot be created nor destroyed, and if we are energy, we're not going to be destroyed. So just what happens with that?
Totally. It's I would 100% recommend that you read her book, Signs: The Secret Language of the Universe. I think for us both, that was one of the key resources and the key things that we read that we were like, oh my God, like this is really speaking to us. And it's a really popular book that our community talk to, don't they, Im, time and time again. And another really interesting book on the topic is Surviving Death by Leslie Kane. So the book that the Netflix documentary is based on, we had Leslie on our podcast, and she's a fascinating lady. But also what's really interesting about her and that book is she is an investigative journalist. And I think she's one of the main US journalists that covers UFOs normally. And she had her brother passed away, and she basically like got this book commissioned to research the afterlife. But she was coming in from like a skeptical place and a place of like evidence and facts, because she's a journalist. That's what she does. And she had all of these experiences that she couldn't put into words, she could put them into words because she wrote a book, but she couldn't explain. and it's very interesting because it's like quite grounded in fact and experience. So for anyone who's like skeptical about it, I'd recommend reading Leslie's work because she puts a really good case forward. But then also Laura's stuff is really good too. But it is weird, don't you? Like when you have a psychic reading, and like I remember, like I had them before my mum died, more as like a fortune teller, future kind of predictor type thing. And then when I was going in, like to try and talk to my dead mum, it's mind bending, and like I always find it just like quite amazing, but also very draining because you're trying to work out like what is going on. Like this is very strange, but also very comforting.
Yeah, so comforting. And even with things like the guilt, like how I mentioned I was experiencing a lot of guilt, actually talking to a psychic helped with a lot of the guilt too, because I felt like I could talk to my mum and kind of get some of those answers that I was carrying around, the answers to the questions that I was carrying around. So yeah, it's actually can be a really comforting thing. There are some dodgy psychics out there, obviously, so just make sure you do your research before. Just make sure you go to someone who's, reputable, got good reviews, before you go and fork out your cash, because it can also be quite expensive.
I'm curious, have either of you two publicly shared any specific medium experiences that left you no doubt that it was real for you?
Yeah, we both had a reading with a guy called David the Medium, who is like a big psychic medium in Australia, but he does global readings. And just the way, I mean, he just, the names of nicknames and things like that, they were just really spot on. And also the way that information that you think, how could you possibly know that? But then also the way that he was talking to us was like, it was just like listening to our mums. Just, yeah.
We had another one with a woman called Carn from Inner Destiny, and she actually told us, she's like, you're going to get a book published, and literally like a month or so later we got an email about a book deal. We're like, what?
Yes.
So yes. That was wild. She actually said there's 2, so if there's another book out there, she said it's going to happen. But like, yes. Yeah, what were you going to say, Sal?
I was going to say, I actually had a reading with her like the other week, like a little follow-up, and she also like, there's something else that we've been planning, we haven't like announced it yet, but there's like a next phase of Good Morning that we were just kind of like workshopping together, and she called it and she was like, are you thinking about doing this, because you should do this. So yes, I feel like Karen Ryan is our like career psychic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I'm gonna need some of that. So maybe we'll talk about that after the podcast. But that's a perfect segue.
Totally.
It's a perfect segue. Not the segue I was anticipating at all. But what's going on? What's going on with the book that you guys have released? What can you share with us? The one that's coming.
So it's called Good Morning: Honest Conversations About Grief and Loss, and it's published on the 2nd of May in the US and Canada. And it's basically like our podcast and our content in book form. It's a very down-to-earth, relatable support group in a book form. I think it's kind of different to anything that's out there, and the feedback has been really positive so far. And we basically look at like all of the ways that grief impacts you, so like emotionally, physically, relationships, coping with loneliness, coping with grief at work. And we bring in lived experiences from other grievers as well. So it's got stories throughout from people of all ages and all types of loss, because we really wanted it to be a place where people could feel seen and heard, no matter how long it's been or what type of loss they experienced. You've probably got loads to add.
Oh, well, no, you've pretty much summed it all up. But what I find amazing about it is people have actually called it uplifting. And I'm like, how the hell do you write a book about grief that's uplifting? But somehow we've managed to do that. So it's not, it's very much like our content in our podcast. It's not all doom and gloom. We've got beautiful illustrations throughout. It's actually a book that's kind of really easy to pick up and put down as well, because grief brain. So we were very conscious of that and wrote that intentionally for that reason. But yeah, people will be surprised. It's actually not a heavy, because I think a lot of the grief books out there can be quite text heavy and clinical and theoretical. But yeah, it was really important for us to write something that's kind of easily digestible. So I think we did that pretty well.
I love that. I mean, just talking to you two for 45 minutes or so, it's gonna make sense. That book is gonna pop. So, and I love uplifting for grief. That's like the way it should be, in my opinion. I don't know. All those other grief books, sure, they're great, they're fantastic, and I think they're all just as important. But it's really cool to change the tonality of it and kind of give death a little bit of a new look in some weird way.
Give it a rebrand.
Yeah. It's like the new Kia. But I don't know if you even have Kias out there. But that's just.
Yeah. make it pop, as you say.
Yeah.
I like that.
There you go. Well, Sally and Em, I really appreciate y'all taking the time to be on here. As I've already mentioned, I really admire the work you two are doing. I'm excited for your new book. I'll have to check it out when it comes out. And I don't know the exact date this is going to be airing, but we'll definitely, whoever's listening now, the book will most likely be out by the time this drops. So I'll put the links in the bio, and you can check it out and purchase their new book and go listen to their podcast, Good Mourning Podcast. These two are fantastic if you haven't gotten the point by now. So again, Sally and Em, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having us. It's been great to chat with you.
Thanks, David. It's been such a treat.
Until next time, guys, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Dead Talks. Please do not forget to hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell. That'll give you updates as to when we post a new video, more episodes, and more content in general. We are streaming on all the major podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Pandora, and all that. And also find us on Instagram at Dead Talks Podcast or www.deadtalks.net. Thank you so much.